Welcome to the Create on Purpose podcast. Have you ever noticed that nature has a way of teaching us about ourselves? Not through words, but through seasons, through storms, through forests, and through seeds. With all the wildfires here in Utah lately, I found myself looking at the mountains a little bit differently. It's easy to look at a burned hillside and see only what was lost: blackened trees, ashes, a landscape that no longer looks the way that it once did. And if you've ever walked through your own kind of fire, maybe you know that feeling. Maybe today you're carrying grief or heartbreak, a diagnosis that you never expected, a dream that quietly slipped away. And if that's where you are, I am not asking you to be grateful for your pain. I'm not asking you to pretend it doesn't hurt. I simply want to share something nature has been teaching me. We don't expect a forest to recover overnight. We don't stand in front of a burned mountain a week later and say, "Why are the trees not back yet?" We understand that nature heals in seasons, but somehow we have this expectation that we can heal on a deadline. We expect grief to be over after a few weeks or months. We expect confidence to return after one good day. Some people think that trust comes back after one apology. We expect purpose to appear the moment life falls apart. And when it doesn't, we can start to think that something is wrong with us. But maybe nothing is wrong. Maybe we're simply trying to rush a process that nature has understood all along. I recently learned about something called scarification. I've been doing a lot of gardening, and every seed packet has its own little instructions, right? So some seeds have this hard outer shell, and they can't grow until that shell has been first weakened somehow. So sometimes it's scratched by rocks, sometimes it's softened by freezing and thawing. Sometimes the seed is carried through the digestive system of an animal, and some seeds don't open until they have experienced the intense heat of a wildfire. Think about that for a moment. The very thing that appears to completely destroy the landscape creates the conditions that allow new life to begin. The fire clears away what no longer serves the forest. Sunlight reaches the ground again. Nutrients return to the soil, and seeds that have sometimes been waiting for years to open finally do. Nature doesn't celebrate the fire, but it doesn't waste it either. And maybe we're not so different. I think about the hardest seasons of my own life, the ones I never would have chosen, the ones I would have given anything to avoid. Loss is still loss, grief is still grief, and trauma is still trauma. But I can honestly say that some of the deepest compassion that I have ever developed, some of the greatest understanding, and some of the purpose that I now feel could have only grown because life cracked me open in places that comfort never would have. We live in a world that celebrates blooming. We applaud promotions, the healed relationship, the successful business, the finish line. But almost nobody applauds the years underground. The quiet work, the counseling appointments no one knows about, the mornings you got out of bed when it took every last bit of willpower you had. Oh, your body is in so much pain. The tiny choices that no one noticed. But slowly, these choices became a different life. And that's where transformation happens. And for some, it's like bamboo. For years, someone waters the ground, day after day, month after month, year after year, and nothing appears to happen. If you didn't know any better, you would think that all that work was wasted. But beneath the surface, the roots of the bamboo plant are spreading, growing deeper and deeper, and building a foundation strong enough to support what comes next. Then, after years of invisible growth, bamboo finally breaks through the surface and grows with astonishing speed. Some people have said this is actually creepy to hear. You can actually hear bamboo growing. People call it an overnight success. Nature calls it years of invisible preparation. I wonder how many of us are living in our bamboo years, wondering if anything we are even doing matters, wondering if we've fallen behind, wondering why everyone else seems to be blooming while we're still buried beneath the surface. Maybe you're not behind. Maybe you're just building roots. Maybe your life is preparing you for something that you can't even see yet. Nature reminds us that the most important growth is often invisible. It happens beneath the soil, beneath the bark, and beneath the surface of our hearts. Maybe you're standing in ashes today. Maybe you feel buried. Maybe you're exhausted from waiting. And if that's where you are, don't compare your season to someone else's harvest. Nature never does. Every forest has its winter, and every seed has its waiting period. Every mountain carries the scars of fires that once seemed impossible to survive. Look at Yellowstone, for example. Yet, year after year, life quietly returns, not because it ignored what happened, but because it learned how to grow through it. Maybe that's what we've been asked to do. Not to erase the fire, not to pretend it didn't hurt, but to become the kind of people who allow even our hardest seasons to grow compassion, wisdom, courage, and hope. Because nature doesn't rush transformation. Maybe neither should we. If today's conversation stirred something in you, I would love to hear about it in the comments. What season are you in right now? Are you standing in ashes, growing roots, or beginning to bloom? And if you know someone who's walking through a difficult season, consider sharing this episode with them. Not to tell them that pain is a blessing, but to remind them that their story isn't over. Wherever you are in the world today, thank you for being a part of mine. Now go leave someone else's world a little better than you found it. Create on purpose.